Continuing debate, the honourable member for Kildonan, St. Paul.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today with great and tremendous disappointment that yet again the Liberal Prime Minister and his cabinet have let Canadians down in quite a tremendous fashion in the last number of days. They have withheld the truth, they have misled the public, they have made egregious errors, taken no responsibility for it. They're making excuses and blaming everyone but themselves. There's been very little, if any, accountability taken, and meanwhile it is the Canadian people and certainly our most vulnerable who suffer as a result. And so the amendment that the Conservatives moved today in the House is calling for the immediate resignation of the Public Safety Minister, given his long track record of misleading this House and the Canadian people, and in particular his latest quite serious failure of leadership and responsibility in a cabinet position that really, beyond many others, needs the public trust, needs a responsible minister, needs to be beyond reproach in this regard, given the magnitude of the files that he or she, in this case he, is responsible for. And so for those who've been paying attention, we are certainly talking about the move from for the most notorious child rapist and killer in Canadian history, I believe, Paul Bernardo, who was recently moved under the Public Safety Minister's watch, under the Liberal government's watch, from maximum security to medium security. A man who I think, I would assume that almost all Canadians believe, and rightfully so in my opinion, should rot in prison for the rest of his life, has now been moved with more privileges to a medium security prison. And the tale that's been has come out in the last few hours and days of what the minister knew and what the Prime Minister knew, or what they're saying their offices knew, and we'll get into that. It's just deeply concerning and shows that very little responsibility is taken, and it's now very unclear, is there anyone in charge in public safety? Because it doesn't seem like there is. And when it's an issue this sensitive, that really has been burnt into the minds of Canadians what this vile killer did, I know for me it certainly evoked a very emotional response and a lot of anger of the failure of responsibility and leadership from the Prime Minister and certainly the Minister of Public Safety, which is why we're calling for his resignation today. And so it was on June 1st, just a few days ago, that Canadians learned that the Correctional Services of Canada was transferring this vile killer from really a segregation section of a maximum security prison where he rightfully belongs, again until his dying days, to a medium security prison, a more open campus style prison. And he certainly doesn't deserve that, certainly from my perspective and perspective, I would think, again, from most Canadians. And I think, particularly for women, but I think most of us are hesitant to have his name glorified and hansard or talked about. He didn't deserve any of that, so I'll just be referring to him as the country's most vile serial rapist and killer of children from now on. But just so that we really know what we're talking about, this is a man who in the late 80s and early 90s kidnapped, raped, sodomized, tortured, often recorded it on video camera, and murdered young women as young as 14, repeatedly. I have a colleague who was a similar age at the time who lived in Ontario at the time, and she was telling me that in school, girls of her age were being told, to watch out for a white van, be careful when you're walking home from school. This is something that is burned into the memory of women of that age, and women generally, I think, and certainly parents of who had children, particularly young girls at that time. So a really horrific man, and obviously there has been tremendous public outrage at the idea, let alone the action, that this man was moved to a medium security prison. And of course the minister really denied knowing. He came out saying, how shocked he was, and it's really frustrating on a number of levels, because we find today, or in the last couple of days, perhaps that's not true at all. It is very well a strong possibility that he did know and failed to act, that the Prime Minister knew and failed to act on this, failed to stop it in any way that they could. And so certainly the Globe and Mail really outlined this well. I'll just quote them. He said, "The Public Safety Minister invoked the wrath of Parliament and the anger of the families of the victims of Mr. Bernardo," again, on Wednesday after CBC News reported that his office had been told that this man would be transferred to a lower security prison in March. He told the House of Commons just yesterday that his office didn't brief him. How convenient, Mr. Speaker, didn't brief him before the prison transfer happened. We also found out in that same Globe and Mail story, again from, I believe it's from Bob Fife and Steve Chase, the Prime Minister's office was also alerted months prior to the transfer. And that was confirmed by a Prime Minister's office spokesperson. They're not even denying it. So I'll give them that tiny bit of credit. They're at least not denying it, though certainly they weren't forthcoming in the last number of days that this had broke to into the public knowledge. And certainly, as the Globe pointed out, this significantly widens the group of certainly staff and likely their bosses, the politicians, who knew about this and yet did nothing about it until, oops, the public found out, and now there's shock. Now there's shock and disappointment from our elected officials that have been entrusted with public safety and ensuring that justice is served to the most vile killers in our history. But no. I just really felt when all this was coming, I really looked at it with disbelief. I felt, Mr. Speaker, like how many times are the Liberal ministers and the Prime Minister going to get away with, oh, I didn't know, I wasn't briefed, my staff didn't tell me, the agency sees this RCMP, they didn't let us know, the information just didn't quite get to the elected officials. How many times do we have to hear that? As Canadians, as opposition critics, how many times do we have to believe that and just move on like nothing happened? We've seen this time and time again, Mr. Speaker, with election interference from Beijing. Oh, we just weren't quite briefed. They didn't pick up the phone and call the former Minister of Public Safety to tell him my colleague, the Minister from, I believe it's Haldeman Norfolk, I want to say, thank you, was being threatened by Beijing and his family was at risk. Oh, CSIS just didn't quite tell him, but they wanted to, but they didn't quite tell him. Or his staff did. Like, it's a bunch of baloney, I think. Once, maybe, but twice, 5 times, 10 times on issues of national security and public safety, we're expected to believe them time and time again. I don't think so, Mr. Speaker. Enough is enough. We need to have the resignation of somebody in this place. There needs to be some accountability, some responsibility taken for the absolute failure to govern. It's really embarrassing, honestly, to be represented by ministers who take no accountability or responsibility for some of the most critical issues in this country. And I just want to be clear what the difference is between, like, why people are so outraged. So we have maximum security, medium security. I just thought this was clear. I wanted to make this clear. When this individual, and why they should have been outraged and moved mountains to stop it, and certainly brought forward legislation by now to stop this, but they haven't. I'll get into that. Anyway, this individual, when he was in maximum security prison, he had very limited movement. He was heavily segregated. He had very little association with anyone. He had very, very, very few privileges. Rightfully so. He deserves to be punished for the rest of his life. Maximum security prison. That's where he has been for almost 29 years, I believe. And so now that he's been moved, again, under the watch of the Public Safety Minister and the Prime Minister who knew for 3 months, now being in a medium security prison, well, now he gets to talk to more people, he gets to walk around more, much less restrictions on him. He doesn't deserve that, Mr. Speaker. I think everyone agrees, and yet here we are. It happened, and they could have stopped it. They knew it was coming for 3 months before it happened. And so, again, you make a mistake, oh, right, oh, fine, okay, well, if it's the first time, maybe I would believe you. It's not the first time, but okay, they didn't know, they weren't informed. Let's pretend that we believe them for one moment. Then why is it that they haven't brought forward concrete solutions so that this never happens again? They have a working majority in this House with the NDP's support. They could have brought forward legislation to signal to Canadians we'll never allow this to happen under our watch, but they have not done so. And every effort by the Conservatives to move motions to stop this from happening again, shouted down by the Liberals. We've also introduced a bill, private member's bill, from the member for Niagara Falls, just yesterday, seconded that bill, Mr. Speaker, to make sure this never happens again. And the Liberals say it's out of their hands, you know, we can't do really anything about it. The minister's sort of tinkering around the edges now. But is that really true? Because I looked at the legislation and I'm seeing a bit of a pattern with their soft on crime, go soft on criminals, forget about the victims approach from the Public Safety Minister, Minister of Justice, to Prime Minister. And if we look at, for example, Liberal Bill C-83, it was adopted in 2019 and it created a standard in Section 28 of the Corrections and Conditional Release Act, this is important, that required prisoner selection to be made by the Commissioner of Corrections based on, quote, the least restrictive environment for that person. That was legislation that they passed in 2019. It was interesting, their bail reform, their soft on crime bail reform bill was also passed that year. So a lot of damage done to Canadians in that short time in favor of criminals at the expense of victims. So this is just another one of those bills. Bill C-83, least restrictive environment for criminals in prison. That was the standard put forward. And so now what do we have? Well, the least restrictive environment for the country's most vile serial killer and rapist of children. This is happening in part by the legislation that they put forward. They've created an environment where this is the case. Least restrictive environment. Least restrictive environment. I'll say it over and over because that was the exact intention of their legislation. And in fact, they repealed a previous conservative standard that was put in under the former Prime Minister Stephen Harper's government, where it said only the necessary restrictions, so necessary restrictions for criminals and vile killers. These guys came in, 2019, bail reform, and the least restrictive environment for those criminals in jail. So now we have that. Mission fulfilled for the most vile killer in the country. So when they say that they can't do really anything about it, it's independent decisions, they can do something about it. They can repeal this section, or probably the entire bill, Bill C-83. If it's anything like this, the whole thing should go in the garbage. But certainly this section, they could have brought forward a bill already. This has been weeks already. So this doesn't happen again. But again, this was the objective, that the worst people that go to prison in this country get the least restrictive environment. So when they say that they can't do anything about it, don't buy it, not true. So again, my colleague for Niagara Falls brought forward a private member's bill, C-42, yesterday that will keep the dangerous offenders like this individual in maximum security prisons. It replaces that legal standard I just talked about from least restrictive environment to necessary and appropriate restrictions. Very measured, very responsible, and certainly in line, I think, with Canadian values on things like this. Second, it also requires that inmates like this individual who are designated by the courts as dangerous offenders, which this individual is. So certainly people who have committed multiple personal injury offenses and are considered so dangerous to the public that their sentences are made indeterminate and no fixed length. So individuals like we've been talking about today, or who have been convicted of more than one first-degree murder resulting in a life sentence. So again, very clear. Guys like this, always maximum security. That is what a conservative government would do. And I honestly think, thank you, yes, I honestly think that the private member's bill, it's fair, it's measured, it should be adopted unanimously by all parties, especially in light of what's recently happened. So in my remaining minutes, let's just really drill into the failure of the minister to take responsibility on this and to try and stop it before this ever happened. Again, this guy is in medium security prison getting to walk around, getting rewarded. He shouldn't be there. He should have been stopped, and yet he failed to do so. So again, on March 2nd, three months ago, actually I'm just going to read. This is from the Correctional Service of Canada. This is what the statement they put out. The March 2nd email contained information notifying them, the Public Safety Minister's Office, of the transfer, along with communications messaging supporting this, or to support this. That was from Correctional Services Canada spokesperson Kevin Antonucci in a statement just on Wednesday. He added that in March, the final date for the transfer hadn't been determined. And so Mr. Mendicino's office also received an email on May 25th. Updated communication messaging, as well the fact that the transfer would occur on Monday, May 29th. So Correctional Services Canada really doing the lion's share of work here, saying, hey, sent you this, FYI, this can be stopped now, reading between the lines of what he's saying. They're not doing the minister any favors. They're like, look, we told you twice. Nothing. We also found out just last night, as I mentioned, that the Prime Minister's office was also informed. I'll read from the Globe. A separate statement from the Minister's office late on Wednesday suggested that when the Minister of Public Safety's team found out about the transfer, the Prime Minister's office may have already been aware, or was already aware of the matter. It went on to say, when a staff member of the PMO was alerted in March by the Privy Council office about the possibility of the transfer, inquiries and requests for information were immediately made to the Public Safety Minister's office. Wow. So when the PMO was told, they immediately reached out to the Public Safety Minister's office and said, hey, what's going on here? And still, Minister of Public Safety, no idea this is going on. No idea the Prime Minister's office is reaching into out to his office for information. It's a bit hard to believe, Mr. Speaker. That is very difficult to believe. Either the minister is so hands-off he has no idea what's going on in any regard in his file, or he knowingly ignored this, or he knew and he's been misleading the public and this House. It's only a couple options there. And given his track record, which I'm going to go into, I think it's the latter. And what's really interesting, what we're seeing from the statement from the Prime Minister's office and the Public Safety Minister's office, blame game starting. Fingers being pointed at each other in public statements to the Globe and Mail. That's how desperate they are to deflect blame. No one wants to take responsibility here, Mr. Speaker. It's very embarrassing. So I'm just going to go through the pattern of behavior, unfortunately, the Minister of Public Safety has had just in recent months. This is just in the last few months, Mr. Speaker, or within the last year. So in January 2022, the minister said he relied on the advice of law enforcement, and we all remember this. He relied on the advice of law enforcement to trigger the Emergencies Act. Right? You remember that, Mr. Speaker. However, we later found out that both the RCMP commissioner and the chief of the Ottawa Police, they testified publicly that they did not ask the government to invoke the Act. That was a big one. That was a big mislead to the public from that minister, we will say. A large falsehood in that regard of a never-before invoked, in essence, War Measures Act that he misled the public about. Pretty significant. He should have resigned then. Then, on October 12, 2022, he was accused of misleading a federal judge after his office backdated government documents on trademark infringements. The minister said the legislation concerning this came into effect 2 weeks earlier than it actually did. Literally, they backdated legal documents. But the minister said this was just, oops, human error, oopsie. Okay, there's a pattern emerging here, Mr. Speaker. August 8th. The minister admitted in a committee that the RCMP was using spyware to gain information on Canadians, but promised that that technology was being used sparingly. Right, Mr. Speaker? It's really, I'm making light of it, but it's just so utterly ridiculous at this point. I'm only 3 points in. We've got 5 to go. January 15th, 2023. The minister said the Safe Third Country Agreement was working despite enormous increases of irregular border crossers in comparison to the previous 5 years. Said really nothing could be done about it. Then 2 months later, the Biden and Prime Minister of Canada came together in an agreement to close Roxham Road. Not telling the truth there, Mr. Speaker. Again, April 25th of this year, claiming that his legislation would not impact hunting rifles. Well, we know how that went. Of course it did. So much so that he had to back down. He's permanently lost the trust of firearms owners and hunters in this country and will never get it back, Mr. Speaker, because of how much he misled the public. And again, May 5th, the minister said he did not read the report into the People's Republic of China targeting an MP in our caucus. He later said that he was investigating why the report was not passed up to him. How many times are we going to have to believe that, Mr. Speaker? Again, May 14th, after saying that the PRC police stations operating in Canada were closed, we found out that that's not the case either. And then finally, what we've been talking about today, said he had no idea despite 2 contacts from Correctional Service Canada to his office, despite the Prime Minister's office reaching out to him. He's saying he never was told about it, and yet he's fired no one for that, which tells me that that's not true. If your staff have failed you so badly, obviously they can't be trusted with the public safety file and they have to go, and yet he's fired no one. It's him that should be fired. The buck stops with him, Mr. Speaker. And so again, I'll just, to conclude in my final minute, what we've been calling on is the following, that the Minister of Public Safety immediately resign, given his total lack of consideration for victims of crime and his mishandling of the transfer to more cozy arrangements of one of the worst serial killers in Canadian history, that this unacceptable move has shocked the public and created new trauma for the families of the victims, and that the Minister of Public Safety's office knew about this for 3 months prior to this vile killer's transfer, and instead of halting it, the information was hidden from families. That is what we moved today. I'll just conclude, Mr. Speaker, that this is about ministerial accountability. We have not seen that in this Liberal government despite so many failures. So many times they've misled the public. So many times they failed to take responsibility. Ministerial accountability seems to be dead in this country under the Liberal government. And ultimately, I will say in conclusion that the Minister of Public Safety, more than most ministers, requires the public to trust him or her. They need public trust. And yet, as I outlined today, in very real time, he has misled the public, let them down, broken that trust time and time again. This is the final straw, Mr. Speaker. Unfortunately, it is time for him to resign. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions?